afternoon or evening or morning, depending which side of the world you are joining this virtual talk. So my name is Janne Lindqvist, and I'm an associate professor at the Department of Computer Science at Aalto. And on behalf of Aalto University, I welcome all of you to this HAIC talk. So at the moment, we still have these HAIC talks virtually, which is great because this way it was relatively easy to bring Marshini here. And before we let Marshini start, I will briefly tell you about the Helsinki-Aalto Institute for Cybersecurity. So that's it was founded in 2016 as a joint initiative between University of Helsinki and Aalto University, and we have three goals. We want to foster joint research in cybersecurity between the two universities, that is Aalto and University of Helsinki, as well as with the industry in the capital region. And as you may be aware now, Finland has nowadays tuition fees for students applying from outside the EU. So both universities were concerned this will negatively affect the number of applicants, and to promote students specializing in cybersecurity, we reached out to our industrial partners, and thanks to generous donations from Huawei, F-Secure, and SSH, we are able to provide scholarships to students from outside EU. And the third goal of HAIC, the Helsinki-Aalto Institute for Cybersecurity, which is why all of you are on this call, is that we have a public outreach program, which is funded by the Dean of School of Science. As part of this outreach program, we invite experts in the area of cybersecurity for enlightening talks and provide you with an opportunity to interact with them. And without further ado, it is a great pleasure to introduce you to Marshini Chetty. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Chicago, where she co-directs the Amioli Internet Research Lab, or AIR Lab. She has a PhD in human-centered computing from Georgia Institute of Technology, United States, and a master's and bachelor's in computer science from the University of Cape Town, South Africa. She's been on the faculty of the computer science department, Princeton University, and also at College of Information Studies at University of Maryland, College Park. She publishes regularly in top venues such as SOUPS, CHI, CSCW, has several best paper awards, and has been funded by National Science Foundation, National Security Agency, has multiple Google Faculty Research Awards, and also the prestigious National Science Foundation Career Award. So welcome, Marshini. It's our pleasure to have you here today.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much, Janne. And I'm happy to be able to beam in to Finland today. So it is morning, but this is the background that I found. So this is like deceiving. It's not nighttime here, but I figured it was more appropriate since it's afternoon over there. So yeah, today I'm going to be speaking to you about some projects that we've been doing on investigating dark patterns, and specifically to think about how we can think about consumer protections in this space. So let me get my mouse. Oops. Okay, so as Janne mentioned, I'm beaming in from Chicago, and I run the AIR Lab, which is my lab, which basically is a place where I can do research all about the internet, because I love the internet. I love that it's connecting us right now. I love that I can beam into Finland. I just love that it enables so many things, and I just love studying it. And so for the past, decade or so, I've been studying different aspects of internet use, including how people deal with privacy and security, misleading online content, and performance and costs. And that's basically what we do in my lab, using a variety of different techniques, including user studies, web scraping measurement, creating tools that we then test with users. And our goal is really to impact consumer protection policy and internet regulations, just to help people to make sure that the internet is very inclusive. So I tend to use, because I come from human-computer interaction and my background is computer science, but I use a user-centered design approach in my work. That means that I often, I'm trying to find out what user needs are. Maybe I'm doing some design, prototyping, implementing systems, and then evaluating them with real users. And then much of my work is informed by theory, theories of privacy, theories of learning, and so on. So I won't have time to go into all the other work that I've done, but in privacy and security, I've looked at mental models, user mental models of drones, software updates, IoT devices, so Internet of Things and tracking. I've also been working on trying to help young kids learn about privacy and security. And then in misleading online content, I'm going to be talking to you today about our work on dark patterns. But in the past, I've also looked at how people have disguised advertising methods. So maybe they're advertising online. And more recently, I've been looking into how to deal with misinformation and disinformation. And then in my past life, I was very much focused on the actual infrastructure of the internet. And so I did a lot of research on internet performance and costs, how to make sure that you're getting the fastest speed so that I'm beaming to you in a good way. So these are the different topics that I've covered in my research to date, but as I mentioned today, I won't have time to go into all of these things. And so today I'm really excited to talk to you about some aspects of the research that I do. And specifically, I mentioned I really love the internet. I'd say the goal of my work in my lab is mainly to make the internet a more inclusive and trustworthy place. And so making the internet more inclusive to me just means focusing on understanding needs for trustworthy internet. I focus a lot on marginalized and underserved communities, as well as looking at humans through the lifespan. I mentioned young kids. We're also looking at how to serve older adults. But today, I'm really going to focus on my work on making the internet more trustworthy. So here, I'm going to tell you about how we've been trying to identify misleading online content like dark patterns, and how we've been well, I won't touch on this as much, but we've also created tools to help people with identifying different types of misleading online content. So why trustworthy content? I'm beaming to you because it's a pandemic still. We're just sort of hopefully coming out of it as globally. And there's, as you might have known in the last few years, a lot of content online that's really hard to critically evaluate. So this might mean, content that's misinformation. It might mean, content where you're being swayed to do things that you may not have otherwise done, or even things like, on social media when people are advertising. And as I mentioned, you may not know that they're advertising. For example, in this example on the right, this is DJ Khaled, who was basically taken to task because he is shown with alcohol. He had a lot of young followers. And several years ago, this was frowned upon because he was seen as advertising alcohol to his young set of followers. So because I want to inform internet policies and I want to also help users to critically evaluate content to protect against online malfeasance, this is why I sort of started thinking about with others about dark patterns. So let's say, I'm using, and I've already talked about the approach that I'm using. So let's say that I want to book my flight so I'm going to start off with talking about dark patterns. So let's say I want to book my flight over there, right? Maybe I'm like, hey, why am I beaming in? Maybe I should just come there. So I start looking for flights, and then I find out it's a little hard to leave today. Maybe I can come tomorrow. Maybe we could do this talk again. And I might search around, find a flight. Yes, I could be there after I teach tomorrow in the evening, arrive by Friday, I think. And I noticed there's only 3 tickets left at this price. And whenever I try to book a flight, which hasn't been recently, I wonder, is this true? Are there really only 3 tickets left at this price? Or is this what we call a dark pattern, right? What if this is just a low and accurate stock count? What if there are only 3 tickets left and I can't get to Helsinki unless I purchase my ticket now? Or is this perhaps something that is trying to manipulate me to get me to book my flight now so that I could come and visit you all, right? So how do we actually know when this is a deceptive practice that can affect consumers negatively? And so what many others, and including myself, have been studying in the last few years are what we call manipulative interfaces, right? So these are also known as dark patterns, and they're basically tricks used in websites and apps that get you to do things like buy a flight impulsively, or sign up for something, give up your data that you maybe didn't mean to do, right? Because you feel pressured. And so more broadly, they basically user interface design choices that benefit an online service provider by coercing, steering, or sometimes outright deceiving you into making decisions that if you were fully informed and capable of selecting alternatives, maybe you may not make, right? So in the case of the flight, still questionable. I'm not sure. I don't know what United is doing on the back end, but it does make me wonder if it is something, because I've searched on flights and given this talk several times, and I always seem to find those numbers of only 3 left at this price. So there are lots of definitions of dark patterns. We won't go into all of them today, but I will show you some examples. So Harry Brignall, a user experience designer in the UK, is the first person to coin the term dark pattern. And he came up with an initial taxonomy based on anecdotes from others around the web of experiences that they had of manipulative interfaces. And more recently, others have built on those definitions, including Colin Gray, Arinesh Matha, and so on, to actually expand the range of things that are now classified as dark patterns, as well as how they actually act and play on users' cognitive and behavioral biases to get them to make certain decisions. More broadly, some others argue that this is all about what's called choice architecture, right? So Sunstein and Thaler, who wrote the book Nudge, a really good book if you haven't read it, they really are saying that everything we put in an interface is a choice, right? We're choosing the visuals, we're choosing the order of presentation, we're choosing what is presented, which means that essentially all designers are choice architects, right? We are choosing the choice structure. What are we showing to the users, the choices they have at any decision-making point? We're showing the information. So we have choice information. What content and how is that content framed is shown to the user. And then we might have these indirect influences that we exert to help push users in a certain direction. And so, the UK Competitions and Market Authority recently released this report about choice architecture, and they consider dark patterns as sort of a subset of a particular type of manipulation. So let's look at an example, right? Many of you, you're in Europe, you may have seen when you sign up for a new site or visit a new site that there is a consent notification for cookies and tracking, right? This is spurred by the General Data Protection Regulation Act, GDPR, where sites have to and companies have to get consent before tracking you. But if you look at these consent notifications, you'll notice certain things, and we'll go back at this. So just look at it for now, and we'll come back to this. So in choice architecture, if we're looking specifically at dark patterns, we might say that dark patterns manipulate your choices, right? They could manipulate the information flow. That means that they could be deceptive and induce false beliefs. They could be information hiding and hide information from you entirely, or they could modify how you're given choices. They might make choices asymmetric, where one choice is easier to access than another. They may be covert, where maybe a user doesn't understand that they're being influenced. Some users may be treated differently from other users, or they may even be restrictive. And again, this is just a subset of attributes, but I just highlight some of them here so that we can start to understand why something might be problematic for a consumer. So let's go back to these examples of the cookie notifications, and we'll see that here there's no way for you to say no to these cookies, right? You either say got it or accept. So immediately you have restricted options. Also visually, the got it and accept buttons are very prominent and easy to see, which makes it much easier to click on that. However, the information about how I should actually decline if I want to is very hidden, right? So this just gives you some idea of how we can start to then, once we know the definitions of what makes something problematic, start to understand how they affect users and their ability to make choices. In this case, you don't have much of a choice to say no. And if you do, you have to go through a lot of hoops to get there. So to summarize, the information here on the choices is hidden, the accept is visually more appealing, and there's no way to say no. But you might think, well, hang on a second, this kind of sounds like just real life marketing, only 3 left at this price, maybe goods priced at $4.99 instead of $5. I've seen things, other marketing tactics in real life, like stores closing and having it going on a business sale. Or even when I go to the store, I don't know if it's the same in Finland, but here in the US, they always put the candy bars right at the checkout so that you would see them just as you're checking out and likely to buy them. But we would argue that no, these are not the same as real life marketing tactics, right? This is happening at a much larger scale. Unlike in a physical store with the tickets and looking at booking the flight, I don't know how many tickets United has, right? I don't have the same level of visibility. Also, they may know a lot about me and other users from gathering data from across the web, right? So they can be very targeted in what they're doing, which makes dark patterns slightly different from real life marketing tactics. And also because they're not just applying to marketing. Sometimes they're used, just like with the GDPR consent notifications, to get you to give up data. So is this actually a problem? This is something that we wanted to answer in our work. And we wanted to figure out, are dark patterns actually prevalent online today? I mentioned that Harry Brignall came up with this taxonomy, and many researchers started looking into this problem, but we didn't really know for sure if this is something that was really prevalent that we needed to pay attention to. And so that's what we did, is we conducted a large-scale study of the top 11,000 shopping websites globally. And we wanted to, go beyond this anecdotal examples of dark patterns to see if these were actually problematic, right? Because if we know that there's a problem, then we can then say to regulators, we need to look into this and we need to do something about it. And so we gathered a corpus of 11,000 of the most popular shopping websites worldwide, according to Amazon's Alexa rankings. And we started to, gather data on this. We faced a couple of challenges. The first is we wanted to do this on a large scale, which meant that we had to find a way to scrape data from the shopping websites, essentially mimic a user using a shopping website. We then had to collect all of that data from the 11,000 shopping websites and store it, as well as analyze it. And so while I won't go into, all the details here, I will say that, just highlight some of these aspects of what we did to address these challenges. So first of all, our shopping bot essentially went and crawled each of these shopping websites pages. We had a classifier to look for product pages. And once we hit a product page, then our bot would act as though it was shopping, right? So if we went to a site, Macy's, which is a big department store here in the US, then our bot would basically land on a random product page like the shoe for these shoes, and then click through various options, right? So maybe look at different options that it can manipulate, in this case, colors, looking at different sizes, and then we would click through and add it to the bag and eventually get to the shopping cart. So when we were doing this, we were taking screenshots and gathering data all along the way at each decision point, and each time we clicked something. And then we stopped and didn't, unfortunately, buy all the products. And so, we stopped at this point when we reached the shopping cart. So we didn't actually check out. So our data set is really based on this subset of product pages on the shopping websites, as well as all the interaction flows that we gathered in between. And what we found is that, as a lower bound, because we didn't crawl all of every single shopping website, that 11% of the website had some sort of dark pattern, that manifested on that website. And I'm going to give you some examples of what these look like. So the first example is what we call urgency. So this is a dark pattern where it's, again, influencing pressure on your choices. In this case, people are trying to get you to buy something. And so often they're using what we saw as timers, where they say, there might be a sale going on, and if you don't try to buy this item or take advantage, you're basically going to miss out, right? So we saw these timers on many different websites. This was a prevalent sort of tactic being used in e-commerce. But more interestingly, we also had another layer of analysis where for certain dark patterns, we actually went and we revisited these sites. And we saw that in many cases, in 157 cases at least, some of these timers were outright deceptive, right? Which meant that once the timer expired, we saw that the stale was sometimes still valid, or the offer did not expire, right? Or that the timer just reset. Again, just meaning that in those cases, there was deception used just to get you to buy something. Another thing that we saw is what's called misdirection. And specifically, we saw a dark pattern called confirm shaming. So confirm shaming here, you'll notice that there are asymmetric choices in these screenshots. Here, the button for if I want to have 15% off my purchase, yes, I'd like the discount is nice and bright, but no thanks, I like full price. It's sort of in different fonts and visually less appealing. And then also has that confirm shaming language to try to get you to do what the provider wants you to do. Similarly here, you can see that again, to decline this particular, this particular offer, the message is no thanks, I'd rather join the pay full price for things club. So again, a lot of sites are using this confirm shaming language to get users to do things, and also making these choices visually asymmetric so that the choices that the user is presented with are not equal. And then we also had what's called this dark pattern of social proof. So here we have many different e-commerce sites using activity notifications. So essentially, these are ways to get you to try to jump on the bandwagon, maybe telling you how many people have viewed something or how many people have an item in their cart. Another example was Jacqueline from Jacksonville just saved $52 in her order. So we believe that this is trying to get you to jump on that bandwagon, feel like you want to do what everyone else is doing. And these were very prevalent in our data set. In some cases, a smaller subset, we also found deception here, right? Where some of these notifications were fabricated. So in threadup.com, one of the sites in our data set, we saw that this Jacqueline from Jacksonville just saved $52 on her order was actually just pulling from two lists of strings, right? So two lists, essentially, one of names of people and one of names of places. And so it could have easily have said, Caitlin from Chicago just saved $52 on her order, right? So in those cases, the messages were just utterly deceptive. And again, these kinds of patterns are being used to get people to actually buy and purchase things. Aside from looking at the dark patterns, we also discovered that there were at least 22 third-party plugins for platforms that enable e-commerce, like Shopify, where you can quickly set up an e-commerce site. And many of these third-party plugins actually advertise that they allow you to easily plug in things like adding urgency, scarcity, which is like low stock counts and things like that, as well as pressurized selling to your website. And a lot of them also do, I think, social proof. So if you want to find out more specifically about the dark patterns work that we did, you can look at all of the dark patterns that we found at this address. So this was work done just before I left Princeton. So the major takeaways from that set of work, basically that, yes, dark patterns are prevalent, right? There's some indication of that. We study this on the web, but others have studied this on mobile devices. And in fact, in the EU, there's a really cool study that I'd refer you to by Nowens et al., where they measured the type of consent notifications that people have done in the EU for general data protection regulation compliance. And so all of these studies collectively do tell us that not only are there dark patterns, but yes, they are prevalent, and yes, we should do something about it. And as I mentioned, although I've shown you dark patterns in the e-commerce space, these also do affect privacy because they can be used to get users to give up data. And so if you're interested, the European Data Protection Board is actually currently seeking guidelines, comments on its guidelines on dark patterns in social media, right? So I encourage you to look at that. It's open for public comment, and it's due, I believe, next week on May 2nd, right? So actively, people are trying to legislate on this matter. And in some cases, I'll mention at the end of the talk, some of the things that have been put in place in different countries. So now that I've told you about dark patterns in e-commerce, hopefully convinced you that yes, they are problematic and they are kind of, something that we should pay attention to. I want to move on to a different type of dark pattern. So here, in more recent work that we'll present at CSCW later this year, we started to look at user needs for deleting accounts, right? And we wanted to, again, look at this issue because that's also related to how you manage your personal data on accounts. And that's important, also an important part of GDPR, where you have the right to delete your data. So many of you know Elon Musk has acquired Twitter. I saw this funny story on the New Yorker yesterday where they said that Musk deleted every Twitter account but his own. And in this sort of satire, they say, well, Musk said he deleted everyone else's accounts to address the #1 problem plaguing Twitter, the relentless flood of voices inferior to mine. And he would consider letting people other than himself back to Twitter on a case-by-case basis. So while this is really funny and obviously not true, it is satire, it does beg the question, well, what does it mean to delete your account, really, right? If you were to go and say, I'm getting off Twitter now, how would you actually do that? And it turns out that it's kind of complicated, so complicated that people like this magazine Wired, they're putting out guides to help you to figure out how you can delete Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, for example, right? So this is definitely not a straightforward process, yet for reasons of maybe you don't support Elon Musk, maybe you have mental health issues, maybe you've experienced cyberbullying, you may want to delete your account and remove your data from a particular site. So what we wanted to know in this work is, how easy is it to delete a social media account? And are there dark patterns being employed to keep users on the platform? And this work, like I said, will be presented at CSCW later this year. So this is kind of a preview of the work. And this is work that we are doing now at the University of Chicago. So again, we face 3 challenges, right? The first is, unlike with the shopping website case, where we could scrape product pages and follow a predefined sort of interaction from adding a product to your cart and landing up at a cart, which is a metaphor that's used on many e-commerce websites. When it comes to deletion options on social media, there's no standard, right? If you're trying to delete your account on Facebook, Twitter, etc., they don't all have deletion options in the same place. And that does make it challenging to collect data and even harder to actually automate that data collection. And still, we also had to get that data, collect it, and analyze it, just like we did in the previous study. However, because of the challenge and because deletion options are not in the same place, we weren't able to easily automate this. And so this became essentially a very manual process, thanks to one really productive undergrad who helped us with this work. And so what we did is a 2-part study. In the first part, we looked at how people actually create, we actually wanted to see what is the task flow. So if you do want to go and delete your Twitter account, what are the tasks involved in that? And how long does it take? How many clicks does it take? And so on. And so we created and then deleted accounts on the top 20 social media websites in the United States. So in this case, we used a different listing called Tranco, and we looked in the US only, and then we teased out social media sites. So social media sites, what is social media, right? So this is something we were faced with, is many of these listings of the top websites don't actually categorize the websites anymore. And so you have to find a way to actually categorize the website. There's some services like the one we used in our previous study that do some categorization for you. And so in this case, we decided, because this was very manual, to get a definition of social media and then pick out the sites manually to get the top 20. And so we use this definition from this paper by Kitzman et al., where this is a pared down version of the definition here. You can read the paper for the larger one, but essentially social media, as they define it, is any platform where users can create, modify, share, and discuss different types of internet content. And so using that definition, we got sites that like Twitter, YouTube, Pinterest, which maybe you know a little bit less, but is used for sharing images of things. And even sites like GitHub end up in this list based on this definition. So here are the findings that we had. The first finding is that account deletion is really not always possible or a simple process. Essentially, when people go to delete their accounts, we found in those top social media websites that there are many different types of account deletion. The language is very confusing. So what one site may call deletion actually means close an account on another site. Another site, other language includes hibernate, deactivation, and so on, right? So there's not a consistent terminology across the sites. And there's 3 different types of account closure that we found. The first was, and we say that accounts can either be recoverable, which means that even if you delete it, you can reactivate it and reinstate it, or they could be irrecoverable, which means you've deleted it and no trace of your data exists. And there are 3 different types of account deletion. First was you can close your account on many of these sites, where it means you can't actually delete the account, but you have to close it. And it means that you can reactivate during that closure period. The other option is you can delete it, but only after you have a forced period of closure, which means that you've got to delete the account, but then they say your account will remain closed for a certain period, maybe 30 days, and then your data will be deleted. And then the final one, account termination option that we found is just delete immediately. So actually, if you do go on Twitter, I believe Twitter does have delete immediately, which is, you can go delete your account immediately and there's no waiting period. And your account is, we think, no longer recoverable. So here are some examples. Etsy, which is a site that sells, where sellers can sell different goods that they make by hand, and Slack, they actually don't have any way to make your account unrecoverable, right? So let me show you specifically. So in Etsy, when you're closing your account, and again, I forgot to mention, but at each stage when we were going through the deletion process, much like in our first study, we collected screenshots, which we then had, about almost 500 screenshots, which we then analyzed. So this is one of the screenshots that we had during the deletion process. So in Etsy here, this account cannot be fully deleted as we might want to understand deletion as being, you cannot recover your account. So Etsy says specifically, as you're going through the closing your account, that you can reopen your account at any time, right? So there's no way to delete your account, essentially. Also, aside from sites not necessarily helping you to actually make your data irrecoverable, many of these sites also have restricted options to delete, particularly on mobile devices. So recall, we created accounts and we also deleted accounts, but I don't recall offhand the exact numbers, but the amount of accounts we created did not equal the amount of accounts we deleted. And that's because of what I said before. We couldn't delete on some sites, right? So only 12 of the top 20 social media websites in the US offer deletion from multiple modalities. And by modalities here, I mean, say from a mobile app or mobile browser, as well as a desktop. And 8 of the 20 only offer one modality. So you can only delete your account in one way from one particular kind of access medium, like a desktop. And the majority of those restricted to deleting accounts from desktop-based mediums. So this means that for some sites, you can create sites on a mobile app, but you cannot delete the account on a mobile app. And I know I'm from South Africa, where people have, a majority of people have just mobile devices and they don't really have access. That is their primary device to access the internet. So this is pretty problematic. If you can create an account on a mobile device, then we think that you should be able to delete from that device as well. So specific instances of this, YouTube and Instagram, you can create your accounts on a mobile app, but you cannot delete them unless you go to the web. In addition, there's a lot of what we call a dark pattern of obstruction in the deletion tasks themselves, right? So sometimes users are forced to jump through hoops again. They may have to go to a site external to the main site to find the deletion option. They may have to, confirm in multiple emails before they're actually able to delete. And there are also cases of confirm shaming. For example, Vimeo has this very sad face, are you sure you want to delete? And then, yes, you can say, I changed my mind. LinkedIn similarly also adds friction to the deletion process. So here it's, Jane, we're sorry to see you go. Are you sure you want to close your account? You'll lose your connections, messages, endorsements, and recommendations. And so this actually, as it turns out, one of the limitations of our study is we didn't have a lot of account history because we just created and deleted accounts. But one of the students involved actually went and tried to delete her actual LinkedIn page, and she saw that there was a lot more friction and a lot more hoops that she had to go through than what we saw here. So again, this is kind of a lower bound of what we saw because we had fairly clean accounts. And then we had two other dark patterns that showed up. One is immortal accounts, which basically mean that your account lives on forever. I showed you how in Etsy, it pretty much seems that your account does live on forever. And 50% of the sites we looked at had these immortal accounts where there was unclear language on what account-related information was retained. And the language was often vague, such as data will be removed. What data? Or data will be inaccessible to other Quora users, or will no longer be viewable on Twitter, right? Again, unclear whether that just means the postings that you've made or if it's account preferences or other information. And similarly, many of these accounts had some sort of forced continuity. So recall, I said, maybe someone wants to delete their account because they're undergoing harassment, they have cyberbullying, or they really want to get off a platform immediately. And so forced continuity means that basically, even though you want to delete your account, you're entering into a period that you don't really want to have where others can still perhaps engage with your content. So 7 of the 20 platforms had some sort of forced continuity. And that means that if a user wanted to delete their account on those platforms, then other users could still interact with their content. And Facebook is one of those. So Facebook posts will still be visible to other users when you have this forced period of closure that they have before you can actually delete your account. So once we actually, did our analysis, we then in this study did a second part where we went to users and we surveyed about 300 users on this crowdsourcing platform called Prolific, which is based in the UK, about their perceptions of account deletion. And we found that, a lot of users spoke about abandoning the deletion process. So 64% of our users had deleted a social media account in the past. When we asked specifically what happened during that deletion, 2/3 of them said that they had successfully deleted. Great. But out of the rest of the users, at least 1/3 said that they had to abandon. Some, less than half, changed their mind. Many could not find the deletion option. And some just said the process was too onerous, right? And there's some overlap here because people checked multiple options. But essentially, we did see a lot of this, not just in our closed-ended questions, but also in the open-ended questions where people were saying, sometimes, they just make it harder to find than it needs to be, or just spoke about how this process, at some point, they kind of had to change their mind because it was onerous. Also, users were confused, just like the fact that, the platforms don't have a consistent language. Many users were confused about what happens to their data after the account deletion and when the account deletion actually happens. The users in our study wanted to protect their privacy, but they also wanted to prevent accidental deletion. And they had mixed feelings on what should be retained and for how long, but many of them felt that it should be mostly under their control and not in the platform's control. So the major takeaways here are that account deletion options language it really needs to be made more consistent. And the outcomes from account deletion have to be clarified for users, such as who has access to your data, what is retained, what are the timeframes involved. And we need to sort of eliminate these dark patterns that are being used in this account deletion processes. But then we also have this question of, well, what is necessary friction? If I accidentally delete my account, that might be a bad thing. For example, on GitHub, before I delete anything, I have to type out, say, a repository name before I delete it. And that check is good to make sure that I don't have accidental deletion. But I guess what I'm saying here is if we look at this data again, we need to know what is necessary friction to prevent the user from doing something they don't want to, and what is unnecessary friction. And I think that's still an open question. So I mentioned this relevant legislation. We've talked about GDPR and the EU, which has been a leader in this regard. The EU has also just signed on the Digital Services Act, which also, I think, touches on some aspects of dark patterns. In the US, probably the most forward-moving state is California, where there's the California Consumer Privacy Act that does have some information about your right to know what data is being collected about you, your right to delete, for example. And this is now going to be expanded upon and replaced by the California Privacy Rights Act, which is still sort of coming into place. And Colorado and Virginia, other states here, are sort of making good inroads in this direction. And one unrelated bill, well, semi-related bill, is there's also a lot of push to regulate for kids and dark patterns targeting kids in particular. So the Kids Online Safety Act is also relevant here. And I do want to say that in the US, and I'm sure this is true in the EU, enforcement doesn't occur. So last year, for example, the Federal Trade Commission, which does oversee internet consumer protections, went after a kids app called ABC Mouse, because ABC Mouse had this program where you could try it free for 30 days, but it didn't sort of make it very clear that people would be enrolled into a recurring subscription plan. And then they also made it really hard for people to get out of this, right? So they had this case where they were settled with the FTC. So future work, where should we go from here? Well, I think we need more measurements. I've mentioned, the studies we've done, but I also mentioned that it's a bit challenging depending on how websites are made up to do this on a larger or a smaller scale. We need more tools to collect data. We need more experiments and studies on user reactions, especially on marginalized users who some studies have shown, including by colleagues here at UChicago, that people who are marginalized may be more susceptible to some dark patterns. And we need ways to raise awareness for the public so that people know when they are actually facing these dark patterns. And that's where I'll leave it today. So I wanted to thank my collaborators and the wonderful students that I work with, as well as some of the funders of this work. And I'd love to take questions. I think that was 45 minutes on the dot.
Thank you very much, Marshini. Wonderful talk. So those who want to ask questions could raise your hand, or you can write to the chat. So I already see there's a comment about this choice architecture at Norway checkout shelves, but then there is a question from Andrea Bess. So I can read it here, that could phone contracts or offers that are sold by phone calls be considered as affected by a dark pattern as well? There's only audio information, no recognition rather than recall or easy memory access to every piece of information in general, and they're well known to hide fees and other mischievous aspects.
Right. So I would say it definitely seems like, as you mentioned, some form of manipulation and sort of marketing to the consumer. But I would argue that it's a little bit different from the kinds of patterns that we're discussing here, which tend to manifest online, although it has similar attributes to those patterns. Like you say, it's preying on your recall, there's no ability to recognize, and information is hidden from you. So I'd say they both sort of leverage these kind of aspects of cognition and behavioral biases, but they sort of manifest in different ways online and in real life. And so they would also be legislated in slightly different ways too.
All right, thank you. Amel has her hand up. Go ahead, Amel.
Yes, hi, Marshini. Thank you so much for the presentation. So I had a question. I'm unable to get my video on, but that's fine. So I had a question regarding the e-commerce, what you have discussed in the beginning of the presentation. So you have had an example with plane tickets, and something that we often see is the expected number of seats left, and that also causes some anticipation to book and stuff like that. I think my question is, what is the line that sort of separates what is a dark pattern from, I would say, like marketing with regards to e-commerce? The question came from me being curious as to where is the definition of what is ethical in this sense, especially that we cannot technically check that these, let's say in this context, airline companies are actually lying about the number of tickets that are left for a certain flight.
Yes.
How were you able to, sorry, how were you able to sort of acquire this motivation to begin this research study? So that's what I'm interested in.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And it's one that basically this whole community does not have a solid answer to. So there is a paper called What Makes a Dark Pattern Dark, which some of my collaborators here actually wrote, which tries to tease out what could make a pattern problematic. And so that's kind of like the attribute analysis that I was showing you of, how we can see whether designs are sort of asymmetric, if they're hiding information and so on. But at the end of the day, it is very difficult. That's why it's a tough thing to sort of, that's what makes it an interesting thing to legislate on, because if it's not outright deception, it's very hard to know what is sort of protecting the consumer, what is necessary friction, what is just marketing versus what is something that's manipulative, right? So in other words, I don't have the answer for you. I think it kind of depends on a case-by-case basis, but I do think designer intent is something that regulators look at, because I think if you are intentionally manipulating users, then that is problematic, and more so than if you are, well, I mean, I think it's still problematic if you're unintentionally doing it. But you're right, in many cases, it isn't clear, like with the airline example, I don't actually know. We didn't measure airlines. And so I'm not sure. I mean, I also know they have space constraints where they oversell, sometimes oversell flights. And so I don't know how they manage things in the background. But I think that, in these cases, like with stock counts, sometimes we knew the stock counts were deceptive in our first study, because again, we were revisiting websites over and over again, and we saw stock counts basically remained low consistently over long periods of time and things like that. And so I think in those cases, it's very clear cut. It's deception, it's a lie. It's kind of like a fabricated social proof message. But in other cases, it may not be clear. Like in account deletion, we don't want people to accidentally delete their accounts. And so some friction in the process is probably good, just to get people, to double check. But then how much is too much? And how much is it, what is the line between too much friction where then you're actually making people jump through hoops to get to delete their account? And I think it isn't always clear. And so that's another area of open research where, I mentioned some of my colleagues have been trying to sort of get us closer to being able to assess different kinds of patterns. And I think from regulators' point of view, they also try to look at what are the harms caused, right? So here, do you have a financial loss? Is there other kind of measurable harm? I think for in legal terms, that's much easier to measure. But I think this is where we need more work. So user studies that can actually show us who's susceptible to different kinds of dark patterns, what kinds of effects they have on users, they're really important. And many people are starting to do these studies, but I think, we need more of them.
Yeah, I agree. And thank you so much for your answer. And this is definitely an interesting area of research. And actually going back to the airline tickets story, it's similarly with the prices of the tickets. And if you try to refresh a page multiple times using the same IP address, you realize that the prices often go higher. And then if you use a different computer or phone, you realize that the price goes back to the way it was. So there's definitely a disadvantage in this, but thank you.
Great.
All right, Sanna, go ahead.
Hi, it seems that I'm too also unable to start my video.
Yeah, I think it's a configuration we
Yeah.
have. Just go ahead.
Yes, thank you. My question is about, do you think that this European way of making legislation to protect consumers is better than the American way of trying to sue afterwards those who feel that they have been mistreated or something like that? But where is this, what is this line, so that how much you can kind of make this protection way? Because for example, this GDPR and its requirement to use these warnings about the cookies, as we all know, those are necessary. But then there are some functional cookies, and then how we can kind of help consumers to figure out what this means.
Yes.
And they don't have time to read those laws or something like that.
Right. So I'll answer the first part of the question, which is, is the European way of legislating on these issues, is that a good direction? I would say yes. I'd say Europe is like a leader in this respect, and regulation does actually matter because it does create incentives for companies to do things because they know that they can actually be taken to task for certain things that they're doing. Right. So I think we've seen this in other spaces, like, for example, we're researching here in the US how school districts deal with privacy and security in educational technologies. And we've noticed that the people we've spoken to in states that have legislation are much more likely to be privacy and security aware than those that are in states that do not have that same sort of legislation. Right. So I think it does make a difference. And I think that it's not a panacea, though. It's not something that's like a silver bullet, right? It's just one part of a comprehensive solution to an issue, right? So I think legislation is a good way to go and regulations are good. But like you said, there are other things we have to take into consideration, like how easy is it for us to enact that legislation? How easy is it, what's the burden on the company? What's the burden on the user? Because even if you explain to users, so I have examples not here, of cookie notifications that show you necessary cookies versus not, that can also be overwhelming to a user, right? So again, it becomes complicated and murky because on the one hand, we don't want to overwhelm the user with too many choices. So we kind of need good defaults. And on the other hand, we don't want to manipulate the user, right? So we have to kind of walk this fine balancing act between good dark patterns and maybe like light patterns or patterns that are actually good. So for example, I think in Nudge, in the book, they talk about getting people to opt into health insurance. I think it was health insurance opt out of health insurance is much easier than trying to get people to opt in, right? So if you make the default something, it just ensures that more people are insured, basically, at the end of the day. And I can't remember if it was insurance or retirement plans, but basically what they were saying is that for certain things, like a good default can actually be beneficial to a consumer because then it might make sure that the right thing happens for them. So I don't always think interface manipulation or interface choices that we give users can be bad. I just don't think that it's straightforward. And so we have to think, okay, what is the burden on the user? How informed are they really? What is the burden on the company? And how does that interact with legislation? So it's kind of like you have to look at all those aspects to get something that actually works, right? And that's very hard. So yeah, hopefully that sort of starts answering the question, which is, I think it's important to do it. I think the US is starting to take note and trying to do something similar, but like I said, it's mainly state by state and not at the federal level. And hopefully we can start figuring out like, what are the costs to users, what are the costs to companies, and like what's easy to implement versus not.
Thank you. Have you also, I have another question. With these 11,000 online shops, did you have any user studies asking whether people have noticed these dark patterns? These common people, not just computer scientists.
Yeah. We did not in our work. However, as I mentioned, this is kind of a really area that's, full with other researchers at the moment. I do know that there are some studies coming out even this year where people have surveyed users. And also I mentioned at UChicago, my colleague in the law school, Leo Strahilowicz, he ran an experiment with about, I think, almost 2,000 to 4,000 users where they exposed users to mild and aggressive dark patterns. And they found that the aggressive dark patterns like hiding information and things like that, they do work. They do work and they do manipulate people and get them to make decisions that, if the dark patterns are absent, they wouldn't have made, right? So this is a growing area where there's other research in that field, but we haven't looked at that specifically in e-commerce.
Yes, thank you very much.
Right, thank you. There's a question again in the chat and I'll just read it. So regarding the shopping website research, did you find evidence of any type of tracking-based price gouging when accessing sites multiple times? That is, can we trust every visitor sees the same prices, etc.? Bonus questions, what are your thoughts on darkpatterns.org?
Right. So we didn't look at that specifically. So we weren't looking at differential treatment or price gouging when we were, it just wasn't a focus of our study. However, I do know that in my class, I've had students look at this and they have noticed kind of what one of the other participants was mentioning, that there are sites that do differential pricing. Also, sometimes when you're trying to delete an account on some of those sites, they actually then offer you a better price than if you weren't trying to delete your account. So it definitely happens. It's just not something that we focused on specifically. And to your point, no, I don't think we can assume that every visitor sees the same price. I think it does happen that there's differential pricing. And darkpatterns.org, love it, love that site. Yeah, I think it's great. It's a great resource. It's got great readings, great examples, highly recommended.
All right. Any further questions? The chat or just raise your hand. While we wait, if anybody has, I have a comment. So I was thinking that, like you, Marshini, said about that airlines overbook, and they actually do that by default. So you could argue that whatever you see on the website, the airline is likely lying in any case. So
Right.
like the dark patterns just vary, and depending if they overbooked, you may or may not have the seat. And so
that's true. That's true. Yeah, the airline case is a very it's a special one because, like you said, it's not like they have physical items.
Yeah.
And so they're working some equation there in the background that we're not privy to.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Any further questions? Okay, there is on the chat. Do you think the average internet user is aware of these dark patterns? What do you think that a broader education campaign would look like?
Those are good questions. I think that people are becoming more aware over time. When we first did this study, in speaking to people or even just giving, talks where I spoke about this work, it was very apparent to me that no one knew what dark patterns were, or even though they had experienced them. So it's often the case that someone say, oh yes, I've seen that, or afterwards say, yeah, this is what happened to me the other day. So I think a few years ago, the answer would be no, but I think now that it's been a little bit more in the popular press, I think more people might know about them or might know that these kinds of manipulations are occurring. In terms of awareness campaigns, I mean, I think we just need, yeah, just more, I mean, starting even at really young ages, we need kind of critical evaluation and critical thinking skills, even from when kids, you know, are in elementary school, right? I think it needs to just carry through, but for adults and people who are already around now, who haven't had that sort of training, we just need to help people critically assess information, right? And so that might be being able to spot a dark pattern, but also being able to spot, say, misinformation and things like that, right? And I think again, there are multiple ways we could attack that problem, try to get more things in the popular media and press, try to have, you know, these kinds of different sort of trainings from younger ages. And even in some cases, you know, I think this hasn't been tried that much. People were thinking of maybe something could warn you about a dark pattern. However, you know, although I think they used our initial data set on e-commerce to build a web extension for some sort of hackathon. It's not something that's easy to do because you need the data to do it, and the dark patterns may manifest in different ways. So I'm not sure that automated solutions have necessarily succeeded yet, but that could be something else to look into, because that also has a double effect of educating users. And there's also a tip line. So if you search for dark patterns tip line, that's another place where you can submit information about dark patterns you've experienced. The problem with tip lines is you have to know about them. So again, I think we just need to find ways to get this out on a more global form, maybe in like TV, if you want to make a TV show or something that has these in the plot line. I think that would be a good way to go. And it looks like, Nina, you are deleted from Facebook.
Okay. All right. I think so. It looks like we are settled with questions. So I think this is a great way to end this. So thank you again for this wonderful talk. It was really, really good. So really, and I'm sure everybody learned a lot from this. So thanks a lot, Marshini.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me, and have a wonderful afternoon/evening.